The first time Blair Miller felt the rain-soaked earth give way beneath her boots, she knew something was terribly wrong in the drainage culvert ahead. The sound that had drawn her from her truck wasn't the usual symphony of North Carolina's woodland creatures seeking shelter from the storm. It was something desperate, something fighting for its life against impossible odds. Her breath caught as she peered into the flooded concrete tunnel, where amber eyes glowed like twin flames in the darkness, surrounded by the harsh cawing of crows who had found easy prey. In that suspended moment between discovery and action, Blair felt the weight of choice settle on her shoulders, the ancient decision between intervention and letting nature take its brutal course that every wildlife biologist faces in their career. What she couldn't know then was that this single moment would alter the trajectory of two lives forever, binding human and wild predator in a connection that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Blair had been driving the back roads of western North Carolina for 3 hours, documenting storm damage to wildlife corridors, when the sound first reached her ears through the drumming rain on her truck's roof. At first, she dismissed it as the typical chaos that followed severe weather: trees groaning, debris settling, water finding new paths through the landscape. But something in the pitch and rhythm of the distress calls made her pull over on the narrow gravel road, her trained ear recognizing the specific frequency of a young predator in mortal danger. The October storm had been particularly fierce, transforming familiar creeks into torrents and turning the mountain hollows into temporary lakes. As the regional wildlife coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, Blair had seen her share of weather-related animal emergencies. What she hadn't expected was to find herself knee-deep in rushing water at dusk, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate a scene that would haunt her for months to come. The drainage culvert, normally dry except during the heaviest rains, had become a death trap. A young bobcat, no more than 8 weeks old by Blair's estimate, was trapped against the concrete wall by the rising water. The cub's spotted coat was plastered against its small frame, making it appear even more vulnerable than its tender age already suggested. But it wasn't the flood that posed the immediate threat. It was the murder of crows that had discovered the helpless kit and seen an opportunity. Black wings beat furiously in the confined space as 5 large crows dove and retreated, their beaks striking at the cub's head and back with methodical cruelty. The young bobcat's cries were growing weaker, its attempts to defend itself becoming more desperate and uncoordinated. One particularly aggressive crow had managed to inflict a gash above the kit's left eye, blood mixing with rainwater as it streamed down the small, terrified face. Blair didn't hesitate. Every protocol she'd learned about minimal intervention with wildlife evaporated in the face of this uneven battle. She waded into the culvert, her presence immediately scattering the crows into the stormy evening. The sudden silence was broken only by the rush of water and the labored breathing of the exhausted cub. "Easy there, little one," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm. The bobcat kit pressed itself against the farthest corner it could reach, golden eyes wide with terror and confusion. Blair could see the tremors running through its small body, whether from cold, shock, or neurological damage from the crow attacks. She couldn't yet determine. Moving slowly, she extended her hands toward the kit, fully expecting claws and teeth in response. Instead, the young bobcat did something that surprised her. It reached out with one tiny paw, as if trying to grasp something solid in a world that had become entirely unstable. The gesture was so human-like, so desperately trusting, that Blair felt her professional detachment crack completely. She scooped the kid into her jacket, feeling the rapid heartbeat against her chest as she carried him from the culvert. The little bobcat didn't struggle, a concerning sign that suggested either severe exhaustion or neurological impairment. As she settled him in a rescue carrier she always kept in her truck, Blair made the first of many decisions that would bend the rules she'd spent her career following. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 2 hours away through mountain roads made treacherous by the storm. But Dr. Ellen Winter's veterinary hospital was only 20 minutes down the valley, and Blair knew Ellen had experience with wild predators from her work with the local rehabilitation network. The drive to the clinic seemed endless, punctuated by worried glances at the carrier where the kit lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. Blair found herself talking to him during the drive, a one-sided conversation that helped steady her own nerves as much as it might have comforted her passenger. "You're going to be okay," she repeated like a mantra. "Dr. Winters will know what to do. She's helped dozens of your cousins over the years." By the time they reached the clinic, the storm had intensified, turning the parking lot into a series of interconnected puddles. Ellen met them at the door, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her kind eyes immediately focused on the carrier. "What do we have?" she asked, leading them into the examination room with the efficient calm that had made her the go-to veterinarian for wildlife emergencies throughout the region. "Young Bobcat, maybe 8 weeks old," Blair explained as Ellen carefully lifted the kit from the carrier. "Found him trapped in a culvert being attacked by crows. Multiple injuries, possible head trauma." Ellen's examination was thorough but gentle, her experienced hands assessing damage while the kit lay surprisingly docile on the examination table. "Dehydration is severe," she murmured, checking the condition of his gums and skin. "Temperature is too low, and you're right about potential head trauma. Look at his pupils." Blair leaned closer, noting how the left pupil was significantly more dilated than the right. "The crows were going for his head repeatedly," she said. "He was trying to defend himself, but he's just a baby," Ellen finished, her voice soft with compassion. "Dr. Miller, I have to ask, what's your plan here? You know the protocols as well as I do." The question hung in the air between them. Blair knew exactly what Ellen was asking. A young bobcat with probable neurological damage, separated from its mother during a critical developmental period, faced slim odds in the wild even if his injuries healed completely. The standard protocol would be humane euthanasia, preventing prolonged suffering while preserving resources for animals with better chances of successful release. But as Blair looked down at the kit, this fighter who had survived being separated from his family, trapped in rising water, and attacked by crows, something in his amber eyes seemed to plead for a chance. "I know what I should do," she said quietly, "but I also know what I'm going to do." Ellen nodded, understanding passing between the two women who had devoted their careers to wildlife welfare. "Then we better get started. He'll need subcutaneous fluids immediately, antibiotics for those wounds, and we should probably start him on anti-inflammatories for the head trauma." For the next 2 hours, they worked together to stabilize the kit. Ellen administered fluids and medications, while Blair prepared a specialized formula designed for orphaned wild kittens. The little bobcat whom Blair had begun thinking of as Max, though she wasn't sure why, showed encouraging signs of responsiveness as his condition improved. "He's going to need round-the-clock care," Ellen warned as they prepared to transfer Max to a recovery carrier. "Feeding every 2 hours, constant monitoring for seizures, temperature regulation. This isn't a commitment you can take lightly." "I understand," Blair replied, though she was beginning to realize she had no idea what she was truly undertaking. "My cabin is set up for wildlife rehabilitation when needed. I've raised orphaned raccoons and opossums before." "This is different," Ellen said gently. "Bobcats are apex predators even as kittens. As he grows, his wild instincts will emerge, and if the head trauma has caused permanent neurological damage—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew that a neurologically impaired predator could never be safely returned to the wild, and permanent captivity was often considered a fate worse than death for wild animals. But as if sensing the gravity of the conversation, Max opened his eyes and made a soft churring sound, the first vocalization he'd produced since his rescue. The sound was so unexpectedly gentle, so trusting, that both women felt their resolve strengthen. "We'll take it one day at a time," Blair decided, lifting the carrier carefully. "See what he tells us about his chances." The drive to Blair's cabin was treacherous, the storm still raging across the mountain roads, but Max seemed calmer now, occasionally making soft sounds that suggested he was more alert despite his injuries. Blair found herself responding to his vocalizations, creating an odd conversation between species that somehow felt entirely natural. Her cabin, nestled in a clearing surrounded by old-growth forest, had been her refuge for the past 8 years. As a wildlife biologist who spent most of her time in the field, she designed the space to accommodate the occasional need to provide temporary care for injured animals. What she hadn't planned for was the emotional impact of bringing a wild predator into her most personal space. Setting up Max's recovery area in her spare room, Blair created a controlled environment that could be gradually modified as he healed. The space needed to provide security and comfort while preventing him from becoming too habituated to human presence, a delicate balance that would determine his future prospects for release. The first night was the longest of Blair's life. Max required feeding every 2 hours, a mixture of specialized formula and medications that had to be administered with careful precision. Between feedings, she monitored his breathing, checked for signs of seizure activity, and tried to regulate his body temperature with heating pads and warm blankets. During those quiet hours, as rain continued to lash against her windows, Blair found herself studying Max's face in the soft lamplight. The gash above his eye was healing well, but she could see other subtle signs of the trauma he'd endured. His movements were slightly uncoordinated, his balance uncertain when he tried to stand. "What are you thinking, little guy?" she whispered during a 3 a.m. feeding. Max looked up at her with those remarkable amber eyes, and for a moment, Blair could have sworn she saw recognition there, not just of her as a source of food and comfort, but as an individual who had chosen to intervene when he needed help most. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. The next few days fell into a rhythm of feeding, medication, and careful observation. Ellen visited daily, monitoring Max's progress and adjusting his treatment as needed. Slowly, encouraging signs began to emerge. His appetite strengthened, his coordination improved slightly, and he began to show more interest in his surroundings. But there were setbacks too. On the 4th day, Max suffered what appeared to be a mild seizure, his small body convulsing for nearly a minute while Blair held him gently and spoke soothingly until it passed. The episode was a stark reminder of the neurological damage he'd sustained and the uncertain path ahead. "His brain is still healing," Ellen explained after examining him following the seizure. "Young animals are remarkably resilient, but head trauma can have long-term effects we won't fully understand for weeks or months." Despite the challenges, Max's personality began to emerge as he grew stronger. He was curious but cautious, playful but never aggressive toward Blair. Most remarkably, he seemed to seek out physical contact with her in ways that contradicted everything she knew about bobcat behavior. Wild bobcats, even those raised by humans, typically maintain their instinctive wariness of human contact. They might tolerate handling for medical care, but they don't usually initiate affection or seek out human companionship. Max was different. He would stretch out his paw toward Blair when she approached his enclosure, and he seemed genuinely comforted by her presence during his more difficult moments. Dr. Ellen noticed this unusual behavior during one of her visits. "I've never seen a bobcat kit respond to humans quite like this," she admitted, watching as Max deliberately reached through the bars of his recovery cage to touch Blair's hand. It could be related to the head trauma. Neurological damage sometimes affects the brain regions that control fear and aggression. Or, Blair said quietly. "It could be that he understands I saved his life." Ellen gave her a skeptical look. "That's anthropomorphizing, and you know it. Wild animals don't experience gratitude the way humans do." But as weeks passed and Max continued to seek out Blair's company, exhibiting behaviors that seemed to demonstrate genuine affection and trust, Ellen found her scientific skepticism wavering. There was something in the young Bobcat's interactions with Blair that defied easy explanation. Max's physical recovery progressed steadily, though some effects of his early trauma persisted. His balance remained slightly impaired, particularly when he attempted the complex movements that would be essential for hunting in the wild. His depth perception seemed affected as well, causing him to misjudge distances when pouncing or climbing. Most concerning from a release standpoint were the neurological quirks that became apparent as he matured. Max would sometimes become disoriented in unfamiliar spaces, circling repeatedly as if his internal compass had malfunctioned. He also exhibited unusual startle responses sometimes, reacting with excessive fear to minor sounds, other times showing no reaction to stimuli that should have triggered immediate flight responses. "We need to face the reality," Ellen said during Max's 8-week evaluation. "His neurological deficits are likely permanent. He'll never have the reflexes, coordination, and judgment necessary to survive in the wild." Blair had been dreading this conversation, though she'd known it was inevitable. Watching Max grow from a traumatized kid into a beautiful young bobcat had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her career, but it had also created an emotional attachment that complicated her professional judgment. "So what are his options?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Permanent captivity at an educational facility or euthanasia," Ellen replied gently. "I know neither option is what you wanted to hear." That night, Blair sat with Max in the outdoor enclosure she'd built as his recovery progressed. He was now 4 months old, his spotted coat full and glossy, his amber eyes bright with intelligence despite his neurological challenges. As she watched him play with a puzzle feeder, occasionally losing his balance but always returning to the task with determination, she realized how much her life had changed since that stormy night in the culvert. Max had taught her things about wildlife that no textbook could convey. She'd learned that the line between wild and tame was more fluid than she'd believed, that individual animals could surprise even experienced professionals with their adaptability and resilience. Most importantly, she discovered that sometimes the act of saving a life changed the rescuer as much as it changed the rescued. But emotional attachment couldn't overcome biological reality. Max needed a future that could provide him with purpose, safety, and appropriate care for his special needs. After considerable research and several phone calls, Blair found what seemed like the perfect solution: the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center in Asheville. The center specialized in caring for non-releasable native wildlife, providing educational programs that allowed animals like Max to serve as ambassadors for their wild cousins. More importantly, they had experience with neurologically impaired predators and a track record of successful placements. "We'd love to meet Max," said Jennifer Santos, the center's director, during their initial phone conversation. "We actually have 2 other bobcats in our program, both non-releasable due to different circumstances. If Max's temperament is suitable, he could potentially socialize with them and be part of our junior ambassador program." The prospect of Max having the company of his own species was tremendously appealing to Blair. She'd done her best to provide appropriate care, but she knew he needed the complex social interactions that only other bobcats could provide. The day came for Max's evaluation at the Blue Ridge Center sooner than Blair was emotionally prepared for. She'd spent 6 months caring for him, watching him grow and develop, and now she had to trust others to provide the best possible future for him. Loading Max into the specialized transport carrier felt like one of the most difficult things she'd ever done professionally. He seemed to sense that something significant was happening, his usual calm demeanor replaced by restless energy as they began the drive to Asheville. "This is for the best," Blair told him during the journey, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to suppress. "You'll have friends there, other bobcats to learn from, and you'll help people understand how amazing your species is." Max made soft churring sounds in response, the same vocalizations he'd produced during their late-night feedings months earlier. Blair had learned to interpret his various sounds, and these seemed to convey uncertainty rather than distress. The Blue Ridge Wildlife Center exceeded Blair's expectations. The facilities were spacious and naturalistic, designed to provide captive animals with environments that encouraged natural behaviors while ensuring their safety and well-being. Jennifer Santos met them personally, her expertise immediately apparent as she assessed Max's condition and temperament. "He's beautiful," she said admiringly as Max explored his temporary holding enclosure, "and remarkably calm for a wild bobcat in a new environment. That neurological damage you mentioned it might actually work in his favor here. Reduced fear responses can make animals better educational ambassadors." They spent the afternoon discussing Max's history, his care requirements, and his potential role in the center's programs. Jennifer introduced Blair to the two resident bobcats who might become Max's companions: Luna, a female who'd lost a leg in a vehicle strike, and Storm, a male with vision impairment from an untreated eye infection. "Socialization will take time," Jennifer explained as they watched the three bobcats assess each other through adjacent enclosures. "But their initial reactions are encouraging. No aggressive posturing, just normal curiosity." As the sun began to set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Blair knew it was time to leave Max in his new home. The decision was logical, necessary, and in his best interests, but it felt like leaving a piece of her heart behind. Max seemed to understand that their time together was ending. As Blair prepared to leave, he approached the front of his enclosure and extended his paw through the wire mesh, the same gesture he'd made that first night when she'd rescued him from the culvert. "Take care of yourself, Max," she whispered, gently touching his paw one last time. "You're going to do amazing things here." The drive home through the mountain darkness gave Blair time to process the complex emotions of the day. She'd succeeded in her goal of giving Max a chance at life, but the personal cost was higher than she'd anticipated. Her cabin felt empty without his presence, the spare room echoing with the memory of late-night feedings and quiet conversations. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Over the following months, Jennifer provided regular updates on Max's progress. The socialization with Luna and Storm had been successful beyond their hopes. The three bobcats had formed a cohesive group that provided each other with the complex social interactions essential for their psychological well-being. Max had also begun participating in educational programs, his calm demeanor and striking appearance making him an effective ambassador for his species. Children and adults alike were captivated by his story and his gentle response to his caregivers. "He's exceeded every expectation," Jennifer reported during one of their regular phone calls. "His neurological quirks actually seem to make him more approachable for educational work. He doesn't have the typical flight responses that make most bobcats unsuitable for close interaction with the public." 6 months after leaving Max at the center, Blair received an invitation to attend the facility's annual fundraising gala. Max would be one of the featured animals in the program, and Jennifer thought Blair might enjoy seeing how well he'd adapted to his new life. The gala was held outdoors on a perfect spring evening, with several animal ambassadors present to help visitors understand the center's mission. Blair watched from the back of the crowd as Jennifer introduced Max to the assembled guests, telling the story of his rescue and rehabilitation. What struck Blair most powerfully was how confident and content Max appeared. His coat was magnificent, his amber eyes bright and alert as he calmly observed the crowd of admirers. When Jennifer finished her presentation, and asked if there were questions. Max did something that made Blair's heart skip. He extended his paw toward the audience, the same gesture of connection he'd offered her so many times. After the formal program ended, Jennifer brought Max in his portable enclosure to where Blair was standing. "I thought you might like to see him up close," she said with a knowing smile. Max's reaction to seeing Blair was immediate and unmistakable. He moved to the front of his enclosure, making the soft churring sound she remembered so well, and extended his paw directly toward her. There was recognition in his eyes, a memory of their bond that had transcended the months of separation. "Hello, Max," Blair whispered, gently touching his offered paw. "You look wonderful." For a long moment they maintained that connection, rescuer and rescued, their lives forever intertwined by a single stormy night and a choice to intervene. Other guests gathered around, moved by the obvious bond between woman and Bobcat, listening as Jennifer explained the remarkable story of Max's journey from near death to his current role as an educational ambassador. Later that evening, as Blair drove home through the familiar mountain roads, she reflected on the unexpected ways life could unfold. She'd set out to save a young bobcat's life and had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes. But the experience had changed her as well, teaching her lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the profound connections that could form between species when circumstances allowed. Max's story had become part of the center's educational programming, inspiring visitors to consider their own relationship with wildlife and the natural world. Children who heard his tale often asked what they could do to help animals like Max, creating ripple effects of conservation awareness that extended far beyond his individual rescue. Blair continued her work as a wildlife biologist, but her approach had been subtly transformed by her experience with Max. She found herself more willing to consider unconventional solutions to wildlife conflicts, more attuned to the individual personalities and needs of the animals she encountered in her professional capacity. The drainage culvert where she'd found Max had been modified after the storm, with wildlife-friendly grading installed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Every time Blair drove past that spot, she remembered the terrified Kit fighting for his life against impossible odds, and marveled at the journey that single moment of intervention had initiated. Years later, when colleagues asked about her most memorable wildlife encounter, Blair would tell Max's story not just as an example of successful rehabilitation, but as a reminder that the most profound connections in life often come from the most unexpected circumstances. She'd learned that the decision to intervene in nature's harsh realities carried both risks and rewards, that the line between helping and interfering was often impossibly thin. But she'd also learned that sometimes, when faced with suffering that could be alleviated, the choice to act with compassion could create outcomes that benefited not just the individual animal, but entire communities of people who found inspiration in stories of successful rescue and rehabilitation. Max had taught her that wild animals were not just representatives of their species, but individuals with unique personalities, needs, and potential for adaptation. His neurological impairments, which could have been seen as tragic limitations, had instead become the foundation for a life of purpose and meaning as an educational ambassador. The gentle paw he continued to offer to visitors at the Wildlife Center had become a symbol of trust between species, a bridge that helped urban and suburban audiences understand their connection to the wild world that surrounded them. In educational programs, his story illustrated complex concepts about human-wildlife conflicts, habitat conservation, and the ethical considerations involved in wildlife management. Most importantly, Max's journey from the drainage culvert to his role as an ambassador had demonstrated the profound impact that individual acts of compassion could have on both wild animals and human communities. His story had inspired donations that supported other rescue efforts, had influenced policy changes that made infrastructure more wildlife-friendly, and had motivated countless individuals to become more actively involved in conservation efforts. As Blair reflected on Max's story during quiet moments in her work, she realized that the young bobcat had given her as much as she'd given him. He'd shown her that the boundaries between wild and domestic, between helper and helped, were more fluid than she'd previously understood. He taught her that successful wildlife conservation wasn't just about preserving habitats and managing populations, but about fostering the kinds of connections that made people care deeply about the natural world. The rain-soaked night when she'd pulled her truck over to investigate disturbing sounds had seemed like just another emergency response in her career as a wildlife biologist. She couldn't have known then that she was about to embark on a journey that would challenge her assumptions, test her professional protocols, and ultimately provide one of the most meaningful experiences of her life. Max's extended paw had become a metaphor for the trust that could develop between humans and wildlife when approached with patience, respect, and genuine care. It represented the possibility of connection across species boundaries, the potential for individual animals to serve as ambassadors for their wild cousins, and the power of rescue stories to inspire broader conservation efforts. In the end, the young bobcat who had fought for his life against attacking crows in a flooded culvert had become a symbol of resilience, adaptation, and the extraordinary bonds that could form when humans chose compassion over convenience, when they were willing to invest time and resources in individual animals whose stories could touch hearts and change minds. The drainage culvert remained, its modified grading now protecting other wildlife from similar fates. But Max's legacy extended far beyond that single location, rippling outward through educational programs, conservation initiatives, and the countless individuals who had been moved by his story of survival, rehabilitation, and purposeful adaptation to a life he'd never been intended to live. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.